Things that start on time and get over quick. So, all right, that's my whole goal in life is to avoid as many meetings as possible. So the purpose here is at this point, part of this whole reason why we're doing these weekly sessions. One is to give you an opportunity to ask any questions as you're doing these things. Occasionally, you're going to run into things where it's just as um, somebody's, so this is an opportunity. Let's see, Justin, is that coming from you? Are they banging
No,
down there? No?
no.
Okay. All right. Just sounds like um gunfire there. I'm sure it's,
Yeah, I heard that.
yeah, more like dropping two by fours. So anyway, so it gives you the opportunity to ask any questions, but then secondly, it's really to keep you on track because people get busy and you're going to be at the end of the 6 weeks and you're going to realize you haven't even opened up the book and then you're going, oh, 46 hours in 2 days, no problem. I'll just try and review that. So I'll put it on 4 times speed and listen to it and while I'm sleeping. So that's just not a good way to do it. So this is just here to keep you going. All right. So this week, we're really focusing on chapters 1, 2, and 3. Hopefully, if you've gotten into it already, you're going to find that this is very foundational. Um, it should be almost just common sense for you guys who have some background in solar. If you don't have any background in solar, you may be being introduced to some terms. Chapter 1 is sort of the obligatory what's been happening, what solar doing. And I think you guys are pretty much aware of that, what's happening there. Solar has and continues to be the dominant technology, really, in the energy community for new generation over the last 5, 6 years. If you look at the numbers at this moment, um, solar and is more than 50% of all new generation. Wind is another, say, 20%. Battery backup is another 20 to 25%. And at first, when they started tracking, because tracking battery backup is a fairly new thing for EIA and all of the powers that be, and I was thinking that's kind of weird. Battery is not really a generating source, but if you think about it, it's stored energy. Well, what is coal? What is natural gas? That's stored energy. It just took a long time for it to store. Well, this is just another source of power, so it's as legitimate as coal or natural gas. I saw some statistics a while ago that when FERC was reporting, I guess there's a long lead time on people who are trying to generate new generation facilities. They've got to apply and then they get told that we're too busy for 5 years and then they get to build their thing. In theory, but really for the next foreseeable future, we're looking at 95% wind and solar. Natural gas, there's a lot of hype about it at the moment, but not that many in the planning stages, and there's a very long lead time for generators. So currently, there are really only 3 natural gas generator manufacturers worldwide. And because there was so little demand for these things, they cut back their capacity to make them. And now there's a new demand ramping up, but there's a 7 year wait in order to get your generator. So you're not going to see a lot of these generators coming online. And I suspect in 7 years, you're not going to see them then either because the price of natural gas in competition with wind and solar is just too expensive. So, and nuclear is dead. That's a dumb thing. These are guys chasing grant money. So, the Trump administration says we've got $400 million to study nuclear. Somebody puts their hand up and said, "Yeah, sure, I'll study it," and cashes the check and then says, "Nope, it's not good." So that's really, they're just spending grant money. It really is not economically viable. And compared to the alternatives. And that's what you always have to look at. How are these things compared to the alternatives? So something may crop up in the future, but for the moment, wind and solar and batteries, of course, are just the only realistic alternative for new generation sources. And as far as the short term um, prognosis for the wind and solar based on all of the new administration guidelines, if you want to be generous, it really just looks like residential solar is the only one impacted for the next few years. All the other ones are, you're given 4 years to get this thing done and still get your tax incentives. 4 years is a lifetime in this world of politics. But the end of this year is legitimately a sort of a drop dead deadline for the residential. And so we're seeing at the moment this ramp up of everybody rushing, trying to get their residential solar installed. And then we'll probably see a fall off on residential builds, after the first of the year. But I suspect, and I told you last time, I think electric prices are going to go up dramatically. I think another thing that we're going to see a lot of, and there's a lot of chatter about it, is do-it-yourself solar. And I just think you might want to keep an eye on that. I don't know how that impacts SOPEC, but you're just seeing a lot of interest in these plug your solar panel into the wall kind of systems. They call them, balcony solar or whatever. They're 120 systems that you just simply plug into an outlet, and they will supplement. They're obviously very small, but I just think you're going to see a lot of people focusing on that, especially when you can't find an installer. So, all right, so that's kind of brushing over chapter 1. Chapter 2, the solar cells, solar modules. Again, hopefully this is not something that's brand new to you. I don't want to go into a lot of explanation about how solar works per se, about how photons, get knocked across the band gap and they have to make a circuit and all of that. We're more interested in this whole course is really designed to say, how do I install, how do I design, and how do I do this in a way that works and I don't get killed? So that's kind of the main thrust of it. It's not a theoretical, how does solar work and who's credited with determining the photovoltaic effect and things like that. But the one thing that I do find that people get a little bit confused about, and I'll just review it here. I'll jump to my whiteboard here. Let me see if I can find that. There we go. All right. You all see the whiteboard there? Okay, good. So really the idea of the IV curve, and this is something that's not intuitive. You may have run across some of these terms, but with an IV curve, and this is something that you'll run into in things other than solar. But really, when we talk about an IV curve, we're talking about amps and we're talking about volts, and we're just plotting it on a graph. And it just turns out that the graph for a typical solar panel is going to look something like this. And the first equation that you have to sort of tattoo into your brain is watts equals amps times volts. So this is the power equation. And it really is just telling you that there is a relationship between these three things. The analogy that they'll often use is the water analogy, where watts is the amount of water flowing through a pipe, amps is the size of the pipe, and volts is the pressure. So you can have high pressure, small pipe, low pressure, big pipe, and get the same amount of water flowing through, and it's a relationship. But amps being the current, volts is you can think of it as water pressure, but it really is a differential in potential. And what is this difference in potential? Well, you've experienced it as a kid where you rub your feet on the carpet and you walk up and touch something metal or your sister's ear or whatever it is you're doing and you get a spark. Well, what that's doing is equalizing the differential in potential. It's arcing, it's jumping, and it's making that equalization. So what is the difference? It really is the difference. It can be positive and negative. It's how much potential difference there is from zero. And what is zero? Well, we picked the biggest thing that existed, and it's the Earth. We just said, all right, the Earth is the biggest thing we can reference, and it's zero. Why is it zero? It's because we said it's zero. We just said, all right, the Earth is zero. Everything is now measured against that number. So that's where you get. And now, if you really get into technical, the Earth is almost never zero. There's differences in potential within the Earth. But one of the things we like to tell the students and the people who came on tour is everything you ever learned in school is wrong, right? So it's wrong by necessity because you need to understand it wrong before you'll understand it right. And by the time you get a lot of wisdom into a subject, you'll realize everything you learned up until then was wrong, and everything you know now, you probably don't know. So, just accept that. So everything you ever learned in school is wrong. That will guide you pretty well. All right, so let's talk about watts equals amps times volts. So this is the IV curve. And the IV curve, well, we use I for amps. We use I for amps when we're talking in the abstract. And it really just comes from the French intensité de courant. And I think it really is just A was taken. I think A was taken by angstroms or whatever. So we just use I. So a good example here is if you say I've got a 60-watt bulb and I've got a 120-volt circuit, well, I can figure out the difference, right? It turns out it's going to be half an amp. Well, you see this being helpful when you're trying to figure out how many things you can plug in before you blow a circuit. If I've got a 20 amp circuit, well, how much stuff can I run in a typical household? That's where it comes in from a practical standpoint. And you'll notice when you write it with a number, we use the A. So half an amp, we don't say 0.5 I, we just say 0.5 A. And again, you're learning a new language here. So on this curve, what is the maximum the maximum amps? Well, in this case, this is going to be 0. This is ISC. So that is the theoretical maximum amps. And I always say theoretical because in order to measure amps, you've got to have current, you've got to have flow. You can measure pressure, water pressure, without the water flowing. But if the water's not flowing, you can't measure the current because by definition, flow, current, amps. Well, if it's 0, it's not flowing. You've got no power going. So it is a theoretical number. ISC, the amps short circuit. That's the theoretical maximum amps that this panel, this IV curve is generated by the panel manufacturer. It's just going to tell you what it is. And the VOC, this is the theoretical maximum volts that panel could generate. And all of these are being measured at standard test conditions. So we're jumping a little bit away from that, but if you want to measure what a panel is doing, you've got to know under which conditions it's currently living. And the powers that be came up and they said it really doesn't matter what the conditions are, as long as we all agree what they are, because then we can compare one panel to another. And so it really is just an attempt to say one 400-watt panel is going to generate similar power to another 400-watt panel. Because I could set it in full sunlight and that's generating something different than if I put the same panel in the dark. So the conditions matter. And the main conditions that we're worried about, sorry, they're doing construction right overhead if you're hearing any of that. But the things that we're worried about is temperature, and standard test conditions assumes 25 degrees Celsius. The other thing we're worried about is irradiance. So we're assuming 1,000 watts per square meter. And then the third thing they measure, which is kind of a throwaway, is 1.5 atmospheres. And We don't really care about that. I don't know why they throw it in. It never really is used. Everybody just says 1.5 atmospheres, and you go, okay. It's basically sea level in the northern, North America and in Northern Europe, which are the only places on the planet that matter. If you were at the equator, it'd be 1 atmosphere, right? Because the sun is directly overhead. But we don't care about people who live at the equator. We're the ones who live in England and the U.S. So we're the ones who write the rules. So anyway, so it's 1.5 atmospheres, and basically the sun's coming in at a slight angle, so it's traversing through 1.5 atmospheres. But we don't worry about that. But we do worry about temperature, and temperature mostly affects volts, and we worry about irradiance, and irradiance mostly affects amps. It affects both of them, but disproportionately. All right, so these are the maximum amps, the maximum volts at STC under standard test conditions. At some point along this curve, you're going to hit a place, and it's usually right in the bend, right about here, where the most power, the maximum power point, is the most power is produced. And here's where the acronyms start to get a little fuzzy. You'll see MPP, you'll see Pmax. It means exactly the same thing. It's just that they haven't standardized on acronyms. Remember, this is a young industry. So I'm surprised they've standardized on ISC and VOC. And if you think about it, how do we get to this number? Well, if we were to put some numbers in here, and let's say we say this is 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, and then we'll just say 30 over here. And this we'll just say is 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. These aren't accurate, but it gives you the sense of it. All right, so at ISC, 5 times 0, 0 watts. At VOC, 30 times 0, 0 watts. So under both of those scenarios, it's generating no power. So both of those scenarios are bad. That's fine for design. And we're going to design, we use these numbers when we're doing our design because they're a worst case scenario. It's like, what's the most amps we could face? Okay, let's use that number when we're designing our wiring system just to be safe. What's the most volts we could face? Let's use that number to make sure we don't exceed the maximum voltage the system is allowed by law. So we're using these as design numbers. But somewhere along the line, we need to know what it's actually doing. So if we were at 5 volts, 5 times, let's say 5, we're going to be at 25 watts. And then if we go to 10, let's say it's 4.9. So now we're at 49 watts. And at 15, we'll say it's 4.5. So whatever 15 is times 4.5, my math, let's see, 67.5. Is that right? We'll just say it is 67 watts. And then we get here 20 and 4. This is going to be 80 watts. So notice as we add more voltage, we're getting more power, which makes logical sense, right? The more voltage, the more power. But then when you start to exceed some point on this curve, 25, and let's say it's at 2.5. So that's going to be 50, 67 again or so. And then down here, if we were to say at 28, we're at 1. So that's going to be 28. So it increases, and then it decreases all the way back to 0. So at some point on the curve, you're at your maximum power. And fortunately, they just called that the maximum power point. And that is the ideal. That is the sweet spot for this panel to be operating at. It's maybe not the most power it could produce at any point, but it is the most power it can produce under the conditions it's currently facing. And it would be great if the panel were always operating at the maximum power point. Well, it turns out there is a device called the MPPT, the maximum power point tracking device, and it's typically located in the first piece of electronics that connects to the panel. So in a microinverter situation, it'd be the microinverter, the optimizer, it'll be there. In a standalone, it's probably in the charge controller. And in a simple grid-tied string inverter, it's going to be in the string inverter. So, first piece of electronic, and it's going to be setting this panel to operate at the maximum power point. And I always think of it like a rheostat. So, it's going to be adjusting probably the voltage to keep it at its maximum power point. And it does this on a millisecond by millisecond basis. So, as the conditions change, so does the maximum power point. Well, under standard test conditions, there is going to be a voltage associated with it, and there's going to be an amperage associated with that maximum power point. So in this case, we call it the VMP, the voltage at the maximum power point, or sometimes you'll hear it referred to as Vmax. And then there will be the IMP, amps at the maximum power point, or IMAX. And these are the amps and volts that the panel should be operating at when it's operating at its sweet spot. But remember, this sweet spot is a moving target, right? So the rated one is based on STC. It's based on standard test conditions. So when you buy a panel, it's going to come with a spec sheet and it's going to tell you what the ISC is, what the IMP is, what the VMP, the VOC, and the PMAX, or the maximum power point. It's going to give you those 5 specifications. And those 5 are important to us. As I said, we use the VOC and the ISC when we're designing the system, and we use the IMP and the VMP when we're trying to figure out what it's actually doing. So there are situations where you want real numbers, such as voltage drop. When we try and figure out what voltage drop is, we're going to be dealing with real numbers because I want to know from here to there, how much voltage am I going to lose? So I'm going to use the actual voltage and the actual amps for something like that. So those are the numbers that we're going to get. That's why I want to highlight this a little bit because, as I said, it's not intuitive. But these numbers become increasingly important. And if you don't understand them at the outset, you're going to get confused as we go deeper in here. So, does anybody have a question on the IV curve and those four numbers that we're dealing with? Give you just a second. Now you can measure the VOC quite easily. If you take a multimeter and you stick it on the leads of a panel, you're measuring VOC. You're measuring the voltage of the panel with no load attached. As soon as you put a load there, you're going to see that voltage drop down a little bit. Then it's going to be dealing at the VMP. Well, maybe not the VMP because you may not be at standard test conditions, but you're going to be at its VMP given the conditions it's facing. Okay, let me trash this and then just point out that, as I said, this IV curve under standard test conditions, it's going to look something like that. But if you get less sunlight, you get lower irradiance, then you're going to get another curve that's going to look maybe something like that. My curves are bad, but it affects irradiance, or irradiance affects amps more. So if a cloud comes over, the curve may jump here. And in the meantime, your Pmax, or your maximum power point, is jumping around as well. So it's moving. It's a moving target. And the maximum power point tracking, the MPPT, is adjusting that. And you'll see when you're dealing with inverters, oftentimes they'll make a mention of how many MPPTs they have. And what they're really saying there is, if you're hooking up strings, how many strings can you hook up that are independently monitored and controlled so that the MPPT is being adjusted independently of what's happening with the other panels? Because shading is a significant issue. If you've got a solar array like this, and let's say, let's make a real simple one where, let's say that we've got 2 strings of 4, but they're all lined up in a row. Okay, so these guys are connected in a string, and a string is just a series connection. And when you hook something up in series, voltage increases, but the amps remain the same. So that's jumping into chapter 4, I think, a little bit. But you've got volts, you've got amps. So if you know what the ISC is, let's say the ISC of a panel is 9.7 amps. Well, if I hook 4 of them up together, the ISC of that string is still going to be 9.7 amps because it doesn't change. Whatever is for one panel, it could be 100 panels in a string, it could be 4 panels, it could be 2, it could be 2,000. The amps are going to stay the same. And that's one reason why when you're doing these daisy chaining of the panels, you don't have to worry about wire size, because the wire size of one panel is the wire size for the whole string when you're connecting them together. That's not the case with microinverters. And I know I'm jumping because I'm assuming you guys have run into terms, and maybe my guess is you know a lot about some things and nothing about other things. So we're touching, we're trying to fill in the gaps more than give you a from the ground up kind of knowledge. But with microinverters, they're connected together in a parallel circuit, not in a string. So there you do have to worry about wire size because the amps are increasing, but the voltage is remaining the same. That's why if you buy an N-phase system, it's going to say, okay, with this proprietary wire that you're getting, you can only hook 13 of them up together. Then you got to go to a second branch circuit, because if you hook more than that together, you're going to exceed the capacity of the wire to handle the amps that you're trying to put through it. But with regular panels, hooking them up together in a string, there is no limitation on that. The limitation is what is the maximum voltage that you can get to before you exceed the capacity or either the capacity or the voltage under law or the voltage that the inverter that you're connecting to can handle. Now, I showed you here with irradiance. So this is cloud cover. But what happens if it gets warmer? Well, if it gets warmer, then the curve is going to look something like this. Let's say it gets a lot warmer, the voltage is going to go down. If it gets a lot colder, it's going to go like that. It's going to be out here. So the important part that I wanted to just show you with this is, notice this is VOC, but the volts can be more, right? The volts can be more than the rated VOC if it gets cold. Remember, standard test conditions is 25 degrees Celsius. A lot of times we have temperature that's colder than 25 degrees Celsius. So that's going to come into play when we start doing string sizes. Okay, so I'm going to stop the whiteboard. Whoops, did I just? Yeah, okay. So any questions on the IV curve, VOC, ISC, VMP? Start to throw out all these acronyms. Everybody loves acronyms. At its very basic, you should understand that a solar cell makes up a solar panel, or actually makes up a solar module. There is a difference between a solar module and a solar panel. It is a distinction that in our world today doesn't make a lot of difference, because I think it came about in the early days when you were talking about smaller panels, that they would sometimes pre-assemble multiple modules into a unit that they referred to as a panel. So multiple cells combined become a module, and then multiple modules, or in today's world, panels, and I use those terms interchangeably, but there is a distinction, becomes an array, right? So that's sort of the hierarchy of how all of that works. In the panels themselves, I know in chapter 2, there's a thing called bypass diodes and blocking diodes. The blocking diodes are basically in the first electronic device just to keep power from backfeeding to your panels. So otherwise the situation you would run into is during the day, your panels might be generating power and you're charging your battery, for example. But then at night, the panel becomes a load and you start basically giving off thermal energy to the universe. And so your batteries would discharge overnight if there was not some way to block that power from going backwards. So you can think of it like a check valve in plumbing, where flow can go in one direction, but it cannot go backwards. So that's a blocking diode. A bypass diode, if you pop open the junction box on the back of a typical solar panel, you're going to see usually three diodes in there. And these are just ways to minimize the impact of shading on your panel. So you're basically creating three circuits within your panel. And if shading occurs on one of them, it doesn't affect the other two. So it's just bypassing. It's a way of bypassing the wire. I use the analogy of thinking of solar a bit like the old-fashioned Christmas tree lights, where if one light in the chain stops working, they just all stop working. The power will not flow through it. It creates a circuit. Well, similar with the cells. If you get shading that blocks the flow of energy, from that point forward, you're getting no energy. It has to start all over again. So having three circuits in a panel, great. Now you've got three separate areas. If one's affected, it doesn't affect the other two. That's one of the reasons why half-cut cells are becoming more and more popular. And what a half-cut cell does is instead of having like a 60 cell panel or a 72 cell panel, they take those cells and they cut them in half. And now you've got, instead of a 60 cell panel, you've got 120 half cells. And then instead of having the junction box up at the top, they put the junction box in the middle. And now you've got 6 circuits coming into that junction box instead of 3. Does that make sense? You basically now got 2 smaller panels connected together by chopping the cells in half. And they're connected together in the junction box. So that's another way of minimizing shading, the impact of shading. You eke out just a little bit more efficiency out of the panel. And it's hard to imagine, but that distance, the distance the wire has to travel from the bottom of the panel to the center as opposed to the bottom to the top, you're going to minimize some voltage drop within the panel itself. So you're basically going from 6 feet to 3 feet in your circuit length, and that's going to give you a little bit more efficiency. So all these panel manufacturers are just trying to figure out every little way they can eke out another 0.1% of efficiency without adding to the cost of their system. So when it works and it doesn't cost you much more, you start to see that become the dominant technology. We saw that with half-cut panels. Now you see them everywhere. PERC is another one. Passive emitter reflective something contact or something like that. Anyway, basically it's like putting a little aluminum foil at the back of the cell, and the photon can maybe bounce back and you get a second bite at the apple. That's kind of what they're doing there. And so by just putting that little reflective coating in the back of the interior of the cell, they get a little more efficiency. So now today it's hard to buy a panel that's not PERC. You'll see that PERC. Not something you're overly concerned about, but it's a term you're going to see thrown around. So you should understand what it means. And you may have wondered why there was such a growth of bifacial solar panels. We saw those go crazy in recent years, where basically a bifacial, you can think of it like a sandwiched cell, a cell pointing from the bottom of the panel and one pointing to the top. And these are really good for ground mounted systems, especially ground mounted systems that are mounted on sand or snow, where you get a light reflective and it bounces off the ground and it hits the bottom of the panel. So it adds a little bit of cost to the panel, but you get more efficiency from the panel than the added cost. But that was not really enough to warrant this huge rise in in the adoption of bifacial. The real reason why back in, say, 2017, 2018 was because when Trump initiated the tariffs, he forgot to include bifacial. So bifacial panels were exempted from the tariffs. So then you're going, oh, okay, well, then I just saved myself 25% on this panel. I don't even care if it works, because I'm going to save money on it. So people were putting bifacial panels on rooftops, and which made no sense at all, but it did make sense because they were cheaper after the tariff. So now in the Biden administration, they did away with that. They corrected that error, but but they still caught on, and especially for ground mounted systems, it's really is kind of the go-to. So any questions about panels, cells, things like that? I'm just jumping through the first three chapters as we go forward. Give you guys a second. All right, so then we get into the types of PV systems. And I think most people who aren't in the solar industry or know what's happening here, they think of solar like, I'm going to buy myself a cabin out in the woods and raise dairy goats and stick it to the man, and I'm going to be off grid and I'm going to be independent. Like at Blue Rock Station, I would say when we show them our solar array, everybody, almost the first thing is, oh, so you guys are off grid. I say, no, no, it's connected to the grid. Most of these systems are connected to the grid. But standalone is still a thing. And I think we're going to find standalone becoming increasingly a thing because the economics of it are turning around. Used to be I used to tell people if you wanted to be standalone, it's going to cost you double, at least double what a grid tied system is going to cost. Well, now most grid tied systems include batteries. So batteries are are really what the big difference in cost was. So once you're including the batteries, whether it's a grid tied system with batteries, which we would call a grid interactive system, or those actually break down into two different components, a DC coupled and an AC coupled system, or a standalone system, they're still all the same bits. You're still going to have batteries, solar panels, and inverters, perhaps a charge controller, perhaps a battery management system if you're using lithium ion. So the difference in cost between a grid interactive system and a standalone system is marginal. What is the big change now is that utilities are making it increasingly difficult to connect to the grid. They're putting barriers in your way. They're putting delays in your way. They're putting fees in there. They're giving you lousy net metering agreements. And so more and more people are just opting to go, you know what, if you make it hard on me, I'll just, I don't need you. So, and in fact, there was a recent study that found in 5 states with particularly high cost of electric, it's actually cheaper now to go standalone than to connect to the grid. And that's something we're going to see repeated over and over and over, especially as the utilities try and force people not to go solar. You know, so more and more people are just going to say, you know what, I'll just go standalone. And I've tried to tell utilities before, your model, you think you're in the business of providing electricity to people. That's no longer your business. You have to consider yourself in the connected energy services market, right? Your superpower is you're connecting people together in an energy platform. Now you have to come up with products that you can sell to them that take advantage of that connectivity. Because I can provide electricity to myself and I can do it cheaper than you can provide it to me. So you need to change your business model or you will go out of business. I don't think they're going to change their model. I think they're going to go out of business. They're going to go out of business like the railroads went out of business. They're no longer the dominant industry, but they're still there performing a smaller function. They'll be the maintainers of wire. the virtual utilities, the virtual power plants, the microgrids, this will become the dominant technology of energy distribution. And of course, standalone at the residential level. In fact, I just saw that there was a huge data center now that's going standalone with its own energy system. It's not, so we're not talking about a cabin in the woods anymore. Now we're talking about 5 megawatt systems that are going to be independent of the grid. Because right now, if you want to connect to the grid with one of these systems, PJ&M or any of these regular, they're saying there's a 5-year wait before they'll even process your application. Well, if you're an Intel or a Microsoft or somebody, and you want to build a big data center, you don't want to wait 5 years. You can avoid that wait simply by going standalone. Create your own little microgrid, your own little universe. So the technology is there, and it's going to be more and more of a thing. So the main structures that we're dealing with is standalone, as I just mentioned, simple grid-tied systems, and that is always and definitely the cheapest, right? You can hook up, it's basically a solar panel, an inverter, and a way to connect to the grid. All the rest is just disconnects and connectivity. That's why a microinverter system is so dead simple. It really is just hook a microinverter to a solar panel and connect it to your circuit breaker box. That's it. That's why you can do that and just plug it into the outlet, because if you plug it into the outlet, you've just connected to your circuit breaker box. Now you're just feeding back to it instead of pulling from it, but you just made that connection. So what's the only thing in your way there? Is you've got to have some way of disconnecting that in case the grid goes down, so you don't backfeed the grid with electricity when the grid is down. So that's the big issue. So you put in one other little component in there. You put in some sort of auto disconnect. If I lose sight of the grid, I just turn off. So the microgrid system, or the microinverter system, is so simple. Now they're making it more and more complicated because we're asking for more features. But at its heart, it is super, super simple. And I know I've worked with a group out in Kansas that are doing like solar barn raising, where one guy will install at their home and they volunteer on other people's homes and they form a group like that. So they're putting in end-phase microinverters, but they're not even putting in a combiner box. They're not even putting in any kind of monitoring. It literally is microinverter to an AC disconnect to the service panel, and that's the whole install. Okay, so what is some of the reasons why we're seeing more and more people adding batteries to their system? This is a relatively new phenomenon, really only in the last 2 or 3 years. Today, I saw a statistic recently. It was like 60% of all new installs incorporate batteries in today's marketplace. 3 years ago, it was what, 5%, something like that. Well, the number one thing is batteries have gotten cheaper, right? That's a big thing, but not as cheap as they should be. We see a lot of markup in that industry. Where we're basically seeing it here, it's about more or less $1,000 a kilowatt hour of capacity. You see that if it's maybe not quite anymore. Some of them are getting cheaper and cheaper, but they're still pretty pricey. But the wholesale cost of that lithium battery is, I think, $100 a kilowatt hour. So there's a 7-8 fold markup on that. And when I talk to some people in like Trinidad and Tobago, they're not seeing that markup at all. They're able to install batteries quite cheaply. We're seeing a lot that's part of the tariff thing, but just we're also seeing that, there's a price point that people are willing to pay, and the people who are selling these realize that, so they're marking them up. Okay, that's one thing. Price is coming down. Second thing is the grid is getting increasingly unreliable in a lot of regions of the country. And so you want your battery just like a UPS, right? I want power when the grid goes down. That's what most people think about when they think about batteries. I want power when the grid goes down. And I think I mentioned last week that the Department of Energy is projecting a 100-fold increase in the amount of power outage that the country is going to face over the next 3 years. So that's going to be a bigger and bigger thing. The other item is the utilities have figured out that they can just screw you on net metering, right? They're going to charge you 25 cents a kilowatt hour and they're going to pay you 4. Well, then why on earth would I sell it to you? Why don't I just keep it and use it? Because the economics are now in my favor. I can just store it, use it, and the payback on that battery system gets increasingly attractive. And then there's the time of day pricing. We don't have that here at least in my part of Ohio, but it will come, where power at different times of day costs different amounts. So the way that you deal with that is short-term storage and use. So the typical power curve at the moment now is because of it used to be that the highest demand period of time during the day was the hottest part of the day in the middle of the afternoon, because everybody was running their air conditioners. So when the utility was the only provider and it was all coming from coal and natural gas, 4 p.m. on a hot August afternoon, that's when the apocalypse was going to happen, because that's when demand was at its highest. Now we're seeing that with the advent of solar, that's also just about when the production is at its highest. So what you're seeing in places that have adopted a lot of solar is the peak load demand from the utilities perspective is shifted to the early evening, just as the array stops producing, but everybody's coming home and turning on all their appliances. And so you'll see wild swings in the cost of electricity. So in the middle of the afternoon, it might be 10 cents a kilowatt hour. And then at 6 o'clock, it becomes 55 cents a kilowatt hour. Well, the way you combat that is you store it in a battery and use it in the early evening. That's quite easy. And more, we're going to start seeing people using their electric vehicles as their battery backup. All of that is technically possible at the moment. Now we're just waiting on standards to agree. And they're projecting 2026 as the year this all happens. Maybe not. Maybe it's 2027, but it's coming quickly. Well, at that point, this is going to be like people stealing pencils at the office. Everybody's going to have a plug-in at the office, and they're going to go home and use power from the office to run their home in the evening. And there will be a bargain between the office environment or Walmart or any of these locations where they say, we're going to give you free power. We're going to allow you to plug in your electric vehicle and charge for free while you're here, in exchange for us using the collective storage capacity of all of these vehicles as a backup for our business should we need it. So that will be the bargain, and it will be a good bargain. It'll be a good bargain for both parts. So every parking lot is going to become a virtual power plant. And this is going to change the way we view power. Ultimately, I think the whole power dynamics is going to shift from, we've always looked at energy as a commodity, and it's a commodity based on a fixed commodity like coal, natural gas. So it's a increasing in price over time and declining in supply. The opposite is true now with renewable energy. It's more like computing capacity. The more it becomes adopted, the cheaper it gets, until the cost of energy approaches zero. And if you map it out, in the not too distant future, we will get to a point where the incremental cost of energy approaches zero. So energy will no longer be viewed as a commodity you buy. You don't buy gallons of gas. You don't buy kilowatt hours of electricity. You buy services that are associated with the energy. Just like you do with computing. You don't buy bandwidth anymore. You buy services associated with bandwidth. You buy Netflix. You don't buy a packet. You don't go to and fill up your computer with bandwidth. You're buying services. So I think this is going to be an interesting dynamic change, and it will completely disrupt the marketplace. And I guess what I'm getting at is we're in the beginning of an extremely disruptive period of time when it comes to energy. And I find it very similar. I worked in telecommunications back in the 1990s, just as they were breaking up the Bell system. And up until that point, for 100 years, telecommunication was Ma Bell provided you with a phone. They owned the phone. They owned the wire. They owned everything, and you paid them a monthly fee. That was it. Today, Ma Bell doesn't exist. Everything is wireless. Now, the whole industry has changed, transformed in just a few decades. We're about to enter into that same kind of mode with our utility system, with our energy distribution system, how we get our energy, and even how we view energy. So this is going to be interesting and disruptive. I think that the sum total of what Trump is doing with energy policy, it will have very little impact on solar. It will destroy the utility model as it currently exists. Utilities, it will accelerate what was already going to be a slow decline in the power of the utilities, because the utilities are going to be, it's going to expose how ill-prepared they are to meet this increase in load demand. And people will have to turn to alternatives, and it will not be the utility who provides those alternatives. So it will accelerate the decline of the utility model as we know it. And you guys, especially in SOPEC, because you guys are in an aggregation kind of mode there, prepare for that. Model out, how would our business change if nobody was buying power from utilities? Now, people are still going to, but you're going to see it decline in importance. So how do you change your business model to adjust for that? So hopefully these are kind of things that you start thinking about as we learn these things. The AC coupled and the DC coupled, those are grid tied systems that are connected to the grid, but they have batteries. So what is the main difference between an AC coupled and a DC coupled system? It really is, what is the form of the power when it goes into the battery? So a DC coupled system, solar panels generate DC power, right? Batteries consume DC power and store DC power. So it's real logical to say, I'm going to take the DC power from a solar array and I'm going to stick it into my battery. And I'm going to take the DC power from my solar array and my battery, and I'm going to convert that or invert that in an inverter from DC to AC. It's a one-step process. Feed DC to DC from the panel to the battery, and then take that power, whether it's coming from the panel directly or from the battery, and convert it to AC so we can use it in our house. That is a DC coupled system. That is the logical system that you would imagine. And if you're installing a solar edge system, that's exactly how it works. That's the primary DC coupled system that's being installed here to residential systems. But what if you've got a microinverter, right? Microinverters are super popular. Enphase is about 60% of all of the systems installed in residential systems here in the US. Well, as soon as that power leaves the panel, it connects directly to the inverter. So it is now leaving there as AC power. But I want to put in a battery. So what do? Well, now I got to take this AC power, convert it to DC, stick it in the battery, and then when I want to use it from the battery, I've got to reconvert it back to AC to use in my household loads. So there is a loss when you're converting in every step of the way. So from DC to DC, there's no loss. It's just simply going in there and charging the battery. But with an AC coupled system, it's going from DC to AC, then from AC to DC, and then back from DC to AC from the battery. So we're going through three different transformations with three different sets of losses. So on the surface, you would just say, well, that's dumb. That's inefficient. Why on earth would I do it? Well, if you've got a microinverter system, it's your only choice, right? But also these conversion losses have gotten so low that you're talking about 1.5 to 2% losses through each conversion. So even though I'm going through three of them, I'm only losing 6% of my power. Well, a few years ago, that was just normal when you went through an inverter. So the losses are not that substantial, even if you're making multiple transitions. Now, from an installer standpoint, it's all pretty straightforward. The batteries that you would use in that AC coupled system do all of those conversions for you. If you open up one of the battery packs from Enphase, it's got a converter in there that takes AC power and makes it into DC, and it's also got microinverters built in there that takes the DC and makes it into AC. So all you're doing is taking a box and it says, here's your positive, here's your negative, click it into place. That's the whole install. The fact that it's going through several layers of conversions is transparent to you, transparent to the customer. So that's the difference between an AC couple and a DC. Also, you may find that you put in an AC coupled system if somebody's got an existing array. Maybe they were an early adopter and they've got an array on their house with a string inverter and now they want to add batteries. Well, their power is coming in AC. It's coming out of their inverter AC. Their system is not designed to connect to a battery. So now you've got to put in a second inverter and a battery-based inverter. So those are a little less rare. I'd say that what is happening with all of these coupling, AC and DC, is we're starting to see these systems become more and more proprietary. So all the different components have to come from the same manufacturer. Used to be you could go out there and buy a panel or buy an inverter or buy a charge controller or buy all the bits and you just mixed and matched. Well, now with Enphase specifically, if you're using Enphase inverters, you've got to use Enphase batteries, you've got to use Enphase combiner boxes, you've got to use Enphase switches. Everything's got to be proprietary. So that's the mode we're in at the moment. And then you're starting to add in battery charging systems that are also proprietary, linking into these systems. When we get into bidirectional charging, that's going to be even more, where I can use the power from my array or from my battery to back up my home. Currently, we're not getting that, but we are seeing the car charging station being integrated in where it's used as a load dump. So that's something that the systems can do right now, where you can set it up and say, I don't want to send power back to the grid and then use the grid to charge my car. Just charge my car when I have excess power available. Rather than sending it to the grid, send it to my car. If I don't have enough, well, then just don't charge my car. Just wait until there is enough. So those are some of the programming you can do. If you go into one of those systems on your phone, and most of them are now managed through your phone, with Enphase, for example, you can say, I want to go with like grid backup, where my battery is there just in case the power goes out. I want to go with self-consumption, where I use as much of my own power as possible without sending any back to the grid. Or I want to minimize my cost. That's where you would go into a time of day pricing thing. So I'm going to change my consumption in order to minimize my cost. And now they've just recently added what they call an AI mode, where you just say, I'm too dumb to make this decision. You make it for me. So the AI is going to make these decisions and decide. And they all now have what they call storm backup. So they monitor the weather reports. And if there's a storm advisory, it automatically makes sure your battery is fully charged and that your electric vehicle is fully charged in the event that there is a power outage. So it just says, okay, all these other things, forget about it. We're going to make sure we got as much juice in this system as possible before the storm hits. And so it's clever. It's clever. So these are features, but that's why installing these systems is becoming more and more complex. And we like to joke that you can install an array in 2 days, and then it'll take you 2 weeks to do all the programming, to get the system communicating with itself and make sure everything is right. A couple other things before we call it. Oh yeah, I would just stop here by saying currently residential systems are limited to 600 volts in the US, commercial systems to 1,000 volts. In the Europe, it's 1,500 volts. I have predicted for many, many years, wrongly as it turns out, that they're going to increase the voltage of our systems. There is nothing inherently safer having a 600 volt system than 1,000 or 2,000 or 5,000 volts. Nothing about that makes anything safer, but it makes it cheaper the higher the voltage. The higher the voltage, the lower the amps, meaning the smaller the wire and the fewer circuits. So if you can increase that voltage, then you're going to decrease the cost of the system. That's why we're starting to see the batteries that are installed. It used to be that we were limited to 50 volts for batteries that are inside the home, but now they're basically saying the limitation is whatever the limitation is of the system. So residential 600 volts, commercial 1,000 volts. Why? It's because it was cheaper for Tesla to manufacture high voltage batteries than low voltage batteries. And these are the guys who show up to the meetings. So anyway, that's the review of the chapters 1, 2, and 3. For next week, if we could get into 4 and 5, this stuff really should be very basic for you. Review. I think I've hit the main highlights, at least the parts I find interesting. And just try and keep up. And we'll see you guys next week. And if you have any questions in between, feel free to drop me an email and I'll try and respond individually. All right. Okay.
Thanks, Jay. We
Take
appreciate
care.
it.
Bye bye.
Yeah. Thanks, Jay.